Breaking news. The BBC is now reporting Oscar-winning actor Sean Connery has died. Connery is best known for playing the British secret agent James Bond across more than a half dozen films. He was 90 years old.
October 31st, 2020. A quiet morning in Nassau, where the most famous silhouette in cinema history finally flickered out. We all remember the invincible 007, but the man behind the Walther PPK spent his final years trapped in a secret medical battle that his family desperately tried to hide. Today, we're digging through the $350 million estate secrets and the war on Bond to reveal the reality of a legend who spent his last days in a self-imposed exile. But first, why he hated James Bond. Sean Connery once famously said that he'd like to kill James Bond. It wasn't just a throwaway line for a bored journalist. He genuinely, deeply resented the character that made him a global icon. Here is the thing you have to understand about the man they called Big Tam back in Edinburgh. He wasn't born with a silver spoon or a tuxedo in his closet. He was born in a tenement in Fountain Bridge, a place where the air tasted like the local brewery and the rubber works. He was a milkman, a bricklayer, and even a coffin polisher long before he ever held a license to kill. So, when he finally stepped into the shoes of 007, he didn't see it as a dream come true. He saw it as a job that slowly started to feel like a prison. The transformation from a rough-edged Scottish bodybuilder to the sophisticated spy we see in Dr. No was actually a massive piece of social engineering.
What did you think was the weak point? Remember you gave an interview once, a long time ago. You said, what do you think was the weakest part of your body?
According to a deep dive by The Scotsman, a major news outlet in Scotland, the director Terence Young basically took Connery under his wing to civilize him. Young was the real-life Bond, posh, educated, and effortlessly refined. He took Connery to his own tailor, taught him how to eat, how to walk, and even how to sleep in a suit so he wouldn't look stiff on camera. By the time they started filming, Connery was playing a version of Terence Young, but the world thought they were seeing the real Sean Connery. This taming of the raw Scot was so successful that it created a public image he could never outrun. The world fell in love with a sophisticated lie, and Connery was the one who had to live it every single day. But as the years went by, the tuxedo started to feel like a straitjacket. Connery began to feel like Bond was a parody of manhood, a monster he'd created that was now holding his personal identity hostage. He'd walk down the street, and people wouldn't see Sean, they'd see 007.
Sean Connery last played the part of James Bond, and he makes a great return as 007.
It got so bad that he'd get into physical altercations with photographers and grew increasingly hostile toward the fans who adored him. He felt that Bond was a simplistic cartoon, whereas he wanted to be seen as a serious actor capable of real depth.
It has on the acceptance and the understanding of this film. Everybody in the room seems to have an opinion. We'd like to hear yours.
It makes you wonder, if he hadn't landed that role, would he have eventually found his way to greatness through a different path? Or would he have just remained the most physically imposing milkman in Edinburgh? He was a man of immense pride, and being reduced to a stuntman in a suit was an insult to his craft. The resentment wasn't just internal either. He made it very public. He famously refused to attend the 007 anniversaries, and he'd skip the big franchise celebrations as if they were funerals. According to an obituary piece in the New York Times, Connery was so done with the character that he fought tooth and nail for more money and more creative control. Not because he loved the movies, but because he wanted to punish the producers for what he felt was a lifetime of underpayment. He believed he was being exploited by a brand that was making billions while he was being treated like a hired hand. He watched the box office numbers soar and felt like a prisoner in a gilded cage performing tricks for a pittance compared to the empire built on his shoulders. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle of a working-class man refusing to be cheated by the big suits in London. Think about that for a second. You have the man who defined the modern action hero, someone every guy wanted to be and every woman wanted to be with. And he's sitting in his trailer, absolutely loathing the very silhouette he's projecting. It's an uncomfortable truth, but the Bond we loved was a character Connery came to despise. It brings up a really interesting question about the price of fame. Do you think an actor should be grateful for the one role that gives them everything, or do they have the right to resent it when that role eventually consumes their entire life? It's a heavy burden to carry when your face belongs to the world, but your soul is still back in Fountain Bridge, wanting nothing more than to be respected for the work, not the gadgetry. For Connery, the answer was a loud, echoing no. He wasn't interested in being grateful. He was interested in being free. But, as we're about to see, his escape from the tuxedo wasn't just about taking off the suit and moving to the Bahamas. It turned into a full-blown war. Because when the emotional resentment wasn't enough to break the ties, he decided to take the fight into the one place where he could truly do some damage: the courtroom. He wasn't just walking away from Bond anymore. He was moving from emotional sabotage into actual legal warfare that would shock the entire industry. He wanted his pound of flesh, and he was prepared to burn the whole bridge down to get it. The legal bloodbath. In 1983, something happened that shouldn't have been legally possible. Two different James Bond movies, starring two different Bonds, hit the theaters in the same year. It was a moment that basically blew the minds of cinema fans everywhere. You had the official Bond, Roger Moore, in Octopussy, and then, suddenly, there was Sean Connery, the man who claimed he'd rather kill the character, returning to the role in a movie titled Never Say Never Again. But here is the thing. This wasn't just a nostalgic comeback for a quick paycheck. It was a calculated, tactical strike designed to humiliate the producers who had built an empire on his back. It was a middle finger wrapped in a three-piece suit. Now here's where it gets interesting. To pull this off, Connery had to ally with a man named Kevin McClory. According to the Deep Dive archives at MR6 HQ, a specialized research site for Bond history, McClory was a writer and producer who had been locked in a legal death match with the Bond estate for decades. Back in the late 50s, McClory had worked with Ian Fleming on a movie script that eventually became the novel Thunderball. Because of a messy legal settlement, McClory ended up owning the film rights to that specific story, including the rights to the villainous organization Spectre and Blofeld himself. For years, the official Eon producers, the Broccoli family, tried to bury him in paperwork, but McClory found a loophole. He couldn't make new Bond movies, but he had the right to remake Thunderball. Connery saw this as the perfect weapon.
Anyway, the picture's called Never Say Never Again, which is going to be released on Friday, October the 7th. Would you welcome Sean Connery?
By joining forces with McClory, he wasn't just making a movie. He was creating a rogue Bond that directly competed with the official legacy. It was literally called the War of the Bonds. The two sets of producers went to war in the press and the courts. The official side tried everything to sabotage the rogue production, including legal injunctions and public relations blitzes to paint Connery as a traitor to the franchise. But get this, the public absolutely loved it. Even though Connery was clearly trying to tear down the house he helped build, people were thrilled to see the original spy back in action. Something was fascinating about watching a rebel taking on a corporate giant. Wait, it gets even more intense. Money wasn't actually the primary driver for Connery here. Sure, he got a massive deal, but according to reports from the BBC, the motive was much more personal. He wanted to show the Broccoli family that he owned the character in the hearts of the audience, and they were just the people who paid for the film stock. He wanted to prove that James Bond wasn't a brand belonging to a studio, it was a persona belonging to him. Every scene he filmed for Never Say Never Again was a statement of power. He was reclaiming the identity he claimed to hate, just to prove he could still wield it better than anyone else. Think about that for a second. Imagine being so successful that your only way to find peace is to try to break the very thing that made you famous. Most actors would give anything for a fraction of that legacy, but Connery was using his legend as a battering ram. It makes you wonder about the mindset required to stay that angry for that long. It wasn't just business. It was a decades-long grudge held by a man who never forgot a slight. Which 1983 Bond film do you prefer?
Production and everything, but you must know what I'm talking about. I just realized that when I started Bond, you started your show.
The official Octopussy or Connery's rogue Never Say Never Again? It's a choice between the corporate machine and the lone rebel, and the answer usually tells you a lot about how you view Hollywood history. But as the dust settled on this legal bloodbath, something started to change. The man who had spent his life fighting to control how the world saw him was about to face a battle he couldn't win with a lawsuit or a rogue script. The physical and mental invincibility he'd projected for decades was starting to crack. Behind the high walls of his estate, the man who fought so hard for control of his character was quietly beginning to lose control of his own reality. The secrets weren't about contracts or movie rights anymore. They were about the human being underneath the legend. The hidden health battle. For decades, the world believed Sean Connery was untouchable, a man who possessed a voice that could command an entire room and a presence that refused to age. But behind the gates of his estate in the Bahamas, the reality was heartbreakingly different. During those final 2 years, the man who had outsmarted every villain on the silver screen was facing an enemy he couldn't outrun or outmaneuver. We now know, through disclosures made after his passing in 2020, that the great Sean Connery was locked in a devastating battle with dementia. It is a diagnosis that his family kept tightly under wraps for a long time, essentially building a fortress of silence around him to ensure that the world only ever remembered the legend.
Mr. Connery, in this time of great political and continuing political change in the world,
Not the struggle. Here is where the story gets deeply personal and, frankly, a bit tragic. According to his wife, Micheline Roquebrune, who spoke with the Evening Standard shortly after his death, the disease had taken a massive toll. She described how the invincible icon was eventually stripped of his greatest weapon, that iconic rumbling voice. Towards the end, he wasn't able to express himself anymore. Imagine that for a second. The man whose very tone defined cinematic authority for half a century was living in a world where he could no longer communicate his basic needs. It's a level of vulnerability that seems almost impossible to associate with the man who played James Bond. His final days were spent in Lyford Cay, an ultra-exclusive community in Nassau, where the elite go to disappear. Micheline was the primary architect of this protective bubble. She worked tirelessly to keep him out of the paparazzi's lens, knowing that one stray photo of a frail, confused Connery would shatter the public's 007 image forever. And get this, according to reports from the Daily Mail, a national newspaper in the UK, the family succeeded so well that for the last few months of his life, Sean Connery literally didn't know he was James Bond. He had slipped into a state where the fame, the movies, and the legacy were all just noise that had long since faded. Now, there is this one last photo that surfaced online, showing Sean and Micheline together on their 45th wedding anniversary. If you look closely, you can see the kindness in his eyes, but you also see the hollowness that dementia leaves behind. It's a beautiful, painful image because it shows the human being underneath the myth. It makes you realize that while we were busy rewatching Goldfinger, the man himself was navigating a silent, lonely world where even his most famous triumphs were forgotten. It humanizes him in a way that no movie ever could. Think about the ethics of that for a second. It brings up a question that families of megastars deal with all the time. Is it right for families to hide a star's illness to preserve their iconic image? Some would say the audience deserves to see the reality of aging, while others argue that a legend deserves the dignity of privacy. Micheline clearly believed in the latter. She wanted him to slip away without the world gawking at his decline. And honestly, she gave him that. He died in his sleep, surrounded by the family that had shielded him from the very industry he had spent his life resenting. But wait, here's where the mystery takes another turn. While his physical decline was being kept behind closed doors, his legal and financial status was very much public record. You see, Connery didn't just live in the Bahamas because he liked the sun and the sand. He lived there in a state of financial exile. The man who fought for every penny of his $350 million estate was hiding more than just a health diagnosis. As he was losing his memory, he was also entangled in a series of tax disputes and real estate battles that threatened to tarnish the very empire he'd built his life to protect.
Are there things now you can't do as James Bond that you could do 22 years ago?
Does that change how you feel about the hero we saw on screen? Knowing the man behind the suit was losing his most basic identity while fighting to keep his wealth secure adds a layer of complexity that the movies never showed us. It's the uncomfortable truth of the Sean Connery brand. He was a man of immense power who, in the end, had no power over the one thing that mattered, his own mind. Tax exile or true retreat. Sean Connery spent his entire life championing the cause of an independent Scotland. But here is the bizarre, uncomfortable truth. The man who became the face of Scottish pride literally couldn't afford to live there. He spent his final decades as a resident of Flickered in the Bahamas, not just because of the turquoise water and the palm trees, but because of a cold, hard mathematical reality. According to a report by The Independent, a prominent British news outlet, Connery was trapped by the 90-day tax rule. If he spent more than 3 months a year on British soil, the government would have swooped in to take nearly 40% of his global earnings. For a man with a $350 million estate, that wasn't just a bill. It was a total deal-breaker. Now, here is where it gets interesting, and honestly, a bit tragic. Connery was effectively a prisoner of paradise. He lived in Flickered, which is this ultra-exclusive, gated community at the western tip of New Providence Island. It's the kind of place where every house has a name instead of a number, and security guards make sure the rest of the world stays on the other side of the fence. But despite the luxury, it was a state of financial exile. He'd spend his days playing golf and looking out at the ocean, but he was always counting down the days on a calendar. He loved Scotland with a passion that bordered on obsession, yet he was a nomad who couldn't die in the country he spent his life championing because the cost of coming home was simply too high. Think about the irony of that for a second. You're the most famous Scotsman in the world. You have Scotland Forever tattooed on your arm, and you're funding the political movement for independence from halfway across the globe. But you can't actually set foot in Edinburgh for too long without the taxman knocking on your door. According to The Guardian, Connery faced immense criticism for this. People called him a tax dodger and a pretend patriot, arguing that if he really loved Scotland, he should be willing to pay into the system that supported his fellow citizens. But Connery, coming from that working-class Fountain Bridge background, had a very different view. He felt he'd earned every cent through his own sweat, and that the British government hadn't done anything to help him when he was polishing coffins for a living. It brings up a massive question about loyalty and wealth. If you were a multimillionaire, would you choose your country or your cash? Would you pay the 40% patriotism tax just to breathe the air of your homeland? Or would you stay in the sun and keep your empire intact? For Connery, the choice was clear, but it came with a heavy psychological price. He lived in a bubble of luxury, but he was fundamentally disconnected from the very culture he claimed to represent. He was a nationalist who was legally banned from his own nation's reality. But wait, it gets even more complicated when you look at his legacy. Even though he stayed in the Bahamas to protect his wealth, he didn't just sit on his money like a dragon in a cave. He was deeply aware of the optics. He knew that being a wealthy exile looked bad, so he tried to bridge the gap through philanthropy. he couldn't take his physical body back to Scotland for more than 90 days. So he set up the Scottish International Education Trust to make sure his money was doing the work he couldn't do in person. He was trying to buy back his standing in a country he was effectively banned from inhabiting. This was the business of being Sean Connery. It wasn't just about acting. It was about managing a massive global brand while navigating the minefield of international tax law. He was a strategist until the very end, ensuring that the wealth he'd fought so hard for, the $350 million he'd clawed away from the Hollywood producers, stayed exactly where he wanted it. But as the money moved into foundations and offshore accounts, the man himself was fading. He had won the war for his cash, but he had lost the ability to spend his final moments in the place his heart never truly left. The 2024 Estate Secrets. When Sean Connery passed away in 2020, most people thought they knew exactly what he left behind: a tuxedo, a legendary filmography, and a massive pile of cash. But since then, the movement of his $350 million fortune has revealed a strategy that was just as calculated as any mission he ever carried out on screen. The secrets mentioned in the title of this video aren't just about his health or his old grudges. They are about his final massive move to redistribute his wealth back to the very place that couldn't tax him while he was breathing. Over the last couple of years, specifically between 2022 and 2024, the world has finally started to see where the Connery millions are landing. And it turns out he's essentially trying to buy the future of Scotland from beyond the grave. Here is the thing that makes this so fascinating. According to the official mission of the Sean Connery Foundation, which expanded its operations significantly after his death, his estate isn't just sitting in a bank account in the Bahamas anymore. The money is being systematically pumped into Scottish film, education, and subtle political causes. It is a brilliant, long-term play. While he was alive, the British government would have taken 40% of his earnings if he had lived in Edinburgh. Now that he's gone, he's found a legal way to send that money back home entirely on his own terms. It's like he waited until he was out of the reach of the taxman to finally show his true financial hand. Now, think about where this money is coming from. To fuel this massive legacy, his family has been liquidating the Bond assets. His incredible Belle Epoque villa in Nice, France, the one where he filmed scenes for Never Say Never Again, went on the market for a staggering $34 million. Even his private retreats in the Bahamas have been part of this massive wealth migration. According to The Scotsman, a leading national newspaper in Edinburgh, the goal of these sales isn't just to enrich his heirs. It's to fuel a next Bond generation in Scotland. He's funding film schools and youth organizations, effectively ensuring that the next cinematic icon from the tenements has a chance to rise without having to polish coffins to survive. Wait, it actually gets even deeper than just cameras and lighting. The estate has been very quiet about it, but there's a clear undertone of political support for Scottish independence woven into where this money is going. By supporting the culture and the youth of Scotland, he's strengthening the foundation of the nationalist movement he spent his life championing from afar. He's essentially creating a legacy that can't be touched by the London bureaucrats he spent decades fighting. It is an uncomfortable truth for some, but Sean Connery found a way to be more present in Scotland's future than he was in its past. This brings up a really interesting debate about how we view a star's impact. Do you think his legacy is better served by building film schools for the next generation? Or should he have focused more on the direct political causes he was famous for supporting? It's a choice between long-term cultural influence and short-term political wins. And Connery clearly went for the long game. He wanted his name to be synonymous with the very survival of Scottish storytelling. Behind all the money, the secret villas, and the high-profile lawsuits was a boy from Edinburgh who just wanted to prove something. He spent his life being civilized by English directors and taxed by a British government he didn't believe in. And his final act was to take every penny he'd fought for and give it back to the soil he was never allowed to stay on. He won the war for his identity by making sure that the next boy from Fountain Bridge wouldn't have to choose between his country and his cash. He wasn't just James Bond. Who did he become? The man behind the gun. When you strip away the $350 million estate, the lawsuits, and the luxury of the Bahamas, you're left with a man who was essentially performing a version of manhood he never intended to play for 50 years. It's the ultimate irony of his life. To understand the man behind the gun, you have to look at the moments before the tuxedo ever touched his skin. Before he was 007, he was just Big Tam, a Scottish bodybuilder who literally stood on the stage of the 1953 Mr. Universe competition. He didn't want to be a spy back then. He wanted to be the strongest man in the world, and he almost took a completely different path that would have changed cinema history forever. Here's the thing that most people don't realize. Sean Connery was actually offered a contract to play professional football for Manchester United. According to his official biography on biography.com, the legendary manager Matt Busby saw him playing in a local match and offered him a deal right there on the spot. But Connery, with that strange analytical mind of his, realized that a footballer's career was over by 30, whereas an actor could go on forever. He chose the stage because it was a better business decision. He was a working-class guy who just happened to be world-class at pretending to be someone else. But then, Bond happened. And as we've seen throughout this investigation, that role became a sort of psychological shadow. He created the modern action hero, the template for every cinematic badass that followed. Think about the roles where he actually got to show his range, like the tough-as-nails Jim Malone in The Untouchables or the weary King Agamemnon in Time Bandits. Those were the moments he felt like a real actor. Yet he knew that when he walked into a room, people were still looking for the Walther PPK tucked into his waistband. It's an uncomfortable truth to swallow, but while we loved the spy, Sean Connery loved the struggle. He loved the grit of his early life more than the polish of his later years. According to a retrospective by MI6HQ, the dedicated archive for 007 history, Connery once remarked that the Milkman nickname was the only one that felt honest to him. He was a man who achieved the absolute pinnacle of global fame only to realize that the view from the top was obstructed by a character he didn't even like. His final years in the Bahamas weren't just a tax retreat or a medical necessity. They were a final, quiet act of rebellion against the industry that tried to own him. He went to a place where he could finally just be Sean, away from the expectations and the cameras. Which brings us to a question that really defines how we look at his body of work. Beyond the gadgets and the girls, what is your favorite non-Bond Sean Connery role? Was it the grizzled mentor, the king, or perhaps the submarine commander? When you look at those performances, you see a man who was desperately trying to show us who he really was. He wanted us to see the bricklayer from Edinburgh, who had the audacity to conquer the world. In the end, his legacy is a complicated masterpiece. He was a nationalist who couldn't live in his own country, a star who hated his most famous role, and a multimillionaire who never forgot the taste of poverty. His final realization, the one he carried into the silence of his last days in Nassau, was that he'd finally won. He'd kept his money, he'd protected his family, and he'd made sure his fortune would go back to the Scottish soil he loved. He had successfully outplayed the studios, the tax man, and even the character of James Bond himself. The silhouette on the poster might be what the world sees, but the reality was a man who fought every single day to remain himself in a world that wanted him to be a myth. He's no longer the spy, the icon, or the tax exile. He's just Sean. And for him, that was always the ultimate goal. From the war on Bond to his final $350 million legacy, one thing is evident. The invincible hero was always human. Tell me, Which secret surprised you most? Share your thoughts below.